Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Racism and Mental Health session. If you have any questions throughout the session, you can put them in the chat and we'll have some people keeping up on that. And then we're going to present the questions at the end. So we're going to hear from Dr. Virtua, and he can begin whenever he's ready.
Great. Thank you, Rosie, and good morning to everyone. Pleased to see so many people participating in this very important event and wonderful learning opportunity. I'm going to be speaking to you today about a particular component of individuals' response to the embedded racism that can be present in medical training and ways in which that response can serve their progress and well-being as they complete their medical education. So just by way of disclosure, windows here, the disclaimer that applies that these are not the views of my home institution at Rowan School of Osteopathic Medicine, nor of the program committee for the conference. They're mine alone, and as such, I'm responsible for them solely. I also wanted to note that I don't have any financial or other competing interests to report. And most importantly, I just want to recognize the invaluable contribution of the many health professional students, in particular, over the almost 2 years I've been at Rowan, the contributions of the medical students at both the School of Osteopathic Medicine and its allopathic partner at Cooper Medical School. My professional journey in life has been largely influenced by the needs of the students I've served, but also my enrichment has come directly from students' willingness to bring their concerns to me and to partner with me as we try to chart their journeys through their educational attainment. For me, one of the biggest aspects of cultural humility as a senior white male is my willingness to listen deeply and to acknowledge to the students I serve as patients in our mental health clinic, to acknowledge the learning that I continue to have, as well as to seek out my own enrichment through reading and personal experiences so that I continue to grow in my ability to recognize and respond to racism and other forms of disenfranchisement that my students experience. Currently, I'm first of all a licensed psychologist in the state of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. In addition, I am someone who provides performance coaching services to the medical students and residents at both Rowan's medical schools. Advance the slide, bear with me. I want to begin by just talking about some basic assumptions. These are assumptions that serve as the foundation for my choice to deploy a performance psychology approach in response to the environmental stressors that students bring to me in their efforts to make it to the finish line as rising physicians. So first of all, this is not a big leap of faith. Racism, as many of us are acutely aware, is alive and well in medical training. It is not something that solely exists outside the institution. It's not something that exists only in the delivery of care or the differential delivery of care to our patients. As late-breaking evidence of this, JAMA's Internal Medicine Journal recently published a study of 27,000 or more students in their response to the annual graduation questionnaire that they deploy, and came forward with convincing evidence, students endorsing at a high level disproportionately based on their membership in non-majority cultures, the increased incidence of mistreatment and discrimination based on their race and ethnicity. These incidents occur obviously in the classroom and the learning experience in the traditional academic sense, as well as in the clinic, in different training settings, and certainly as part of the policies and practices of many institutions. Second assumption is that racism adversely impacts medical student mental health and professional performance. This isn't something that just slides off the backs of the students that I serve. It is very much something that requires an additional battlefront as they conquer the expectations and standards that they're held to as rising physicians in training. Many students experience the pressures of medical school across a number of domains, and I just want to point out the range of areas that contribute to the stress of being a medical student and going through training as a physician. Each of these is intensified in the presence of racism and discrimination. We all know that there are a few other areas that have as intensive a commitment to high stakes performance as medical school. There's something like 220 to 250 exams or assessments that a student will go through in their 4 years of medical school, and their completion of each of those steps has to happen in a lockstep fashion, or they risk staying back. There's a huge investment of time, money, effort, delayed dreams, and when those things are jeopardized by the possibility of not progressing, there's a huge burden on the student. There's also, as we all know, quite a bit of competition for limited training opportunities. The standards for performance are very much dictated by performance on these high stakes exams. And there's differential access to the professional networks that allow students to further their careers, whether at the clinical rotation level or at residency and beyond. Finally, there's alienation from one's social supports, particularly intensified with the nature of the quarantining required by the COVID pandemic, but certainly made much worse when students are not feeling welcome in their home institution. And finally, the tools all accumulate in terms of the physical and mental health of each student and their ability to do self-maintenance while they conquer the demands on their time and energy academically. At Rowan School of Osteopathic Medicine, research underway includes assessing students for depression and anxiety. And consistent with national trends, we've identified students as experiencing a high level of depression and anxiety secondary to their training. Sorry, I'm having some feedback that the microphones are not functioning properly, so I'm going to remove the headphones. My apologies. So these statistics support the notion of the impact of medical training on student mental health, as well as the fact that racism, sexism, and homophobia will only intensify these impacts on students' well-being. Next assumption is that institutional change occurs slowly. Often more slowly than students can move through their institutions, and as a result, the need to wait for that change to occur in order for students to experience a decrease in racism and bias and a decrease in the toll that takes on their functioning is limited. Typically, students are investing in change that will help those that come behind them. And the fact that they're even willing to do this while they battle to complete their education speaks to the nobility of the students who take up the cause in that regard. And it's something that has given me great admiration for them. Final assumption. As an institution, as a society, we have a fundamental ethical obligation to support those individuals most directly impacted by racism within schools. When a student is not performing to their full ability because of the social stressors and the corrosive impact of racism on their personal well-being and functioning, that has downstream effects that will impact not only those individuals and their careers, but also their families, their own well-being and physical health, and certainly the success of the institutions in which they're training and the patients that they eventually will be serving. As a society, we can ill afford to undermine our own efforts to better provide for the needs of our populations, in particular the need to provide for representation within medicine and the attention to racism that's existing allows us to preserve the resources that we invest in bringing physicians on board. So in terms of the need not to wait for the our commitment to heading upstream while we also work on systemic change allows us to make sure that Black medical students, as well as other students who are similarly impacted, do not have to wait until they experience serious mental health symptoms in order to receive the support they deserve. This helps to avoid the tendency to pathologize someone for suffering from an environmental stressor, and also makes it easier for somebody to seek support rather than to risk being stigmatized because of the impact of an environmental stressor. These resources help to bolster their innate capacity for adaptive coping. Students come to medical school having already been identified as the best of the best. And we owe it to them and to our institutions to ensure that they are able to maximize their talent and abilities and maintain their strengths that got them to us in the first place. And one of the ways we can do that best is to not handicap them by having to battle not just the academic challenges, but also the impact of racism and other forms of discrimination. The interventions I'm going to talk about today are twofold. They involve the performance psychology approach that deals with mindset, our mental strength and our mental coping with adversity, as well as looking at managing threats to professional identity. Those threats are equally corrosive in that they infect and contaminate our view of ourselves and contribute to disengagement from the task at hand. So just briefly, performance psychology, it's an approach that looks to engage individuals in the enhancement of specific mental skills. Too often when we're thinking about performance, even when we're thinking about doing something very difficult, we focus on the notion as a unitary function or skill. It's something that we think in euphemistic terms. I got to psych up, I have to get my head straight. We tend not to think of the complexity that is involved in performing difficult tasks at a high level. Performance coaching is simply the ability to help people to identify those discrete skills and to perform better especially when excellence counts the most. A typical sports psychologist, whether serving physical athletes or, in this case, mental athletes, as I view our medical students, will draw on numerous parts of their toolkit, goal setting to visualization, rehearsing of skills and preparing for battle, so to speak, but also regarding the ability to regulate one's physiological activation versus relaxation, looking at how our attitudes regarding setbacks and disappointments impact us moving forward, and certainly promoting the benefits of help seeking and resource recruitment. I often am saying to our students that no one who's truly amazing is a one-person show. Olympic athletes, executives, anyone who's doing something truly difficult has a squad or a team of support functions being provided in order to reach the pinnacle of their achievement. Part of why I've found myself making use of a performance setting approach is that early in my work with health professionals, it became clear that the traditional medical model that focuses on psychopathology is deficient in its ability to provide the gains that students are looking for. Having first begun working with pharmacy students, coming right out of high school and doing a doctoral program, a 6-year doctoral program, they would come in talking less about roommate problems and more about how to memorize for the next organic chemistry exam. Their disappointment, despite their intellectual abilities, their fear and anxiety and the performance pressure that ensued made it clear that there was a need to bolster their mental skills so that they could perform at their full abilities. This is most typically seen with medical school because of the difficult task demands, but especially because of the uncertainty of outcomes that students face. Each day, in fact, students are deploying for their tasks without a clear sense of how they will perform. They dive into it and do their best and have to tolerate and become comfortable with the discomfort that comes with not knowing how things will go. The downside of that is that often students are struggling with their concerns about failure and take themselves to task because of how conscientious they are, but also out of concern for how they'll be seen by their peers and family and friends and the authority figures whom they look up to for their training and development. So there is an inherent emotional jeopardy that students go through in medical school. Doing difficult things often comes with a crisis of faith. And that's something that I talk about regularly with students. I also think it's important for students to understand that they are capable and actually responsible for explicitly and intentionally managing their mindset. That's not a question simply of talent or effort or strategy for that matter, but very much how they learn to tolerate discomfort, but also how to persevere in an enduring way. While there's talk about resilience and mental toughness and other terms, the phenomena that I find most consistent with our students is the need to develop mental stamina, that they can keep coming back each day to do the hard things that are asked of them. In terms of doing things, we often will think about our intellectual or IQ, work ethic, our conscientiousness, but there's actually quite a few components that come together to result in peak performance. And that occurs on a motivational level. There's information processing, emotional processing, problem solving, and monitoring where one stands in the group that they're part of. The emotional processing is actually a very critical piece to mental skills. Students, because they are going for something that's very difficult and also very important to achieve, given all that they've invested, will experience threats to their survival. And part of my job is to help them to differentiate what's a true threat versus what is something that they're going to persevere through and need to see past the acute survival response, the so-called fight or flight response that many of us will have when something really dangerous or something really important is in play. Ideally, what we're looking for is to help students not to exist in a comfort zone. Conversely, also not to exist in that fight or flight mode where they're panicking. We want students to be able to be invested in their learning, engaged and attentive, an alertness to their focus that allows them to maximally take in the volume of information that they're responsible for. Many of you are familiar with Carol Dweck and her notion of growth mindset. That's something that applies to all of us, not just students, but what you'll see is that the difference between taking a growth approach to one's learning versus a survival approach is quite dramatic in terms of its benefit. Students are primed to look at their grades and their exam results in order to judge their well-being and their success. But in fact, as they learn as they go along, we very much need to focus on our knowledge and skills in order to demonstrate competency, whether on boards or on future clinical rotations. The focus on scores is a byproduct of needing to meet minimum standards in order to continue one's development, but it can't be an end in itself. And so frequently I'm working with students on how to integrate their commitment to their growth with their commitment to surviving the next trial or hurdle that's in their way. Learning is an outcome. We talk about grades and conclusion, but it is also very much a process, and in this case, it's a mental process, all the more so. We look at knowledge acquisition as a mind game and students as mental athletes. And in looking at that notion of perseverance or stamina is the secret sauce. It is what students develop in greatest quantity. It's what they've demonstrated in the leading up to their successful acceptance to medical school. But it is accompanied by two other key components. One being the ability to accurately appraise reality and in particular appraise their situation and performance, as well as the ability to manage the emotional upheaval that comes with things that are very difficult and simultaneously very important. So I use a very concrete model with students. I talk about a three-stage cycle of performance, both at the micro level when they're studying and preparing for exams, as well as the overarching completion of their medical training. The first stage, fuel, is really very much a preparation stage. We need energy, we need motivation. Folks talk about confidence. I actually think that it's more useful to think about the conquering of self-doubt, the sense of purpose that fuels us to do hard things and to keep showing up. In the actual performance, whether we're trying to concentrate during a study session or perform on a high-stakes exam, focus is everything. If we can't have our thinking brain present, then we're not going to be able to complete the task successfully. And so focus needs to have underpinning it emotional poise. In the third phase, feedback, that's where we're looking at how we've performed and looking at how we can improve on our performance, what we need to maintain and sustain in terms of successful performance. And that loops back to preparing for the next round of performance in the high-stakes game of medical school. This is a little bit more fleshed out. What I've identified here is that there are certain challenges, or what I call performance themes and traps. When we're in preparation, that determination and sense of purpose, or as some of us say, the strength of our convictions, is what we use to counter the doubt and fear, the ambitious challenge ahead of us. Especially at the beginning of medical school, students, because of their strong intelligence and their high level of conscientiousness, can see the finish line and see it clearly and accurately perceive just how difficult that performance is, but we're less able to see what the steps are along the way to attain that level of proficiency that comes with being a high quality physician. So it's easy to fall into doubt and despair because we become intimidated by the steepness of the climb, if you will. This is where you see students talking about imposter syndrome, and to some extent that can lead to isolation and alienation. We start to question whether we can make that climb successfully, and whether we're unique in that difficulty. The performance phase includes that need for focus, and with it, the ability to tune out distraction. Really, the way that I think of this is that we're prone to emotional hijacking, the looking ahead to the finish line and worrying about a grade, time traveling into the past and thinking about past setbacks or difficulties. Those erode performance because they literally take our focus off the page or the task at hand. And simultaneously, we can have performance pressure in the exam, in the task that we're performing, such that we blank out or we start to second guess our performances and as a result underperform compared to our true abilities. The final phase, when we're getting feedback on how we've performed, either through our own assessment or specific feedback from other individuals and the institution as a whole, the danger is that we aren't always open to learning from that feedback. If we feel that that feedback threatens our survival, psychologically speaking, or even just in terms of our standing as a physician in training, we will often experience shame or feel victimized and find ourselves turning away from the work at hand rather than learning from the experience. So just in brief, the virtuous cycle that I try and promote with my students in terms of them championing their cause involves them ramping up for performance, delivering on results, and then focusing on regrouping and recharging. What we're trying to do is help them avoid becoming derailed, finding themselves doubtful, then distracted, then defeated. Obviously, that's a place that's not going to promote successful performance. Just shifting in the time that remains before we take questions, I want to just say a little bit about physician identity development. As opposed to the focus on mental performance and mental skills, there's an additional component in terms of how we identify as we enter a professional role or professional career. The institutions that train us as health professionals, no less so in medical school, have an inordinate emphasis, or at least in terms of the curriculum, an inordinate emphasis on knowledge mastery as well as technical or skill mastery. When students are showing up for class, when students are in the lab or on a rotation, they're expected to develop and demonstrate their understanding of medical information as well as medical practice. But there's an additional component of professional development that involves role mastery. And oftentimes this is relegated to the sidelines in the sense that it's talked about in terms of ethical mandates within our role, or more pragmatic concerns. The focus that I'd like to draw on this area of role mastery is in terms of the social norms that come with occupying the role of physician. We have a component of our identity that is more about self, and a parallel component that is about self in the world, or our social identity, if you will. And when we're attempting to enter a role, and in this case, become a physician, we're not just trying to master information and skills, as much as that can feel like it's all that's asked of us. We are also trying to compare and identify whether we're acting like other individuals who are either rising physicians or physician exemplars, our supervisors, our faculty, our role models. When we're doing that, what we're looking for is to conform to the expectations of the group. Physicians exist as a professional guild. Physicians are a group and a club that students are looking to join, with all the responsibilities and privileges that ensue. But students spend 4 years in medical school conducting what's, in essence, a tryout or audition, and each day they wake up and begin the audition anew from where they left off the day before. And the experience of that on one's personhood is dramatic. When it's going well, students have a rush of energy and self-worth and lock in on the strength of their conviction that, yes, this is what I wanted to do. This is where I wanted to go. It's all coming together. I can feel it. I can taste it. Best day ever. Conversely, when their experience of the role, their experience of their belonging and mattering and conforming to what they believe is expected of a physician is not going well, then once again, self-doubt will enter the room, and they'll be questioning in absolute terms whether they belong, whether they have what it takes, whether they were a mistake or an imposter. So I very much take this on in the work that I do with students to identify, in particular with racism and sexism and homophobia, how the experiences of the environment around us can induce a violation of our sense of conforming to the role, particularly if I feel that I'm being asked to leave an important part of me behind. It can create a crisis of faith as to whether I truly want to participate in that role, whether that role or that professional community has room for me as I am, rather than how I would have to be. So there's a theory that I rely heavily on in this regard, drawing on social psychology, motivational theory. Ryan and DC have a longstanding notion around what's called self-determination theory, having 3 components to it. These are the most fundamental drives that influence how we go about our business in the world once we've met our physiological needs for shelter, for nutrition, for physical safety, if you will. So we have a need for autonomy. In the case of the medical student, a sense of being responsible for their own success, for relatedness, for a sense of, again, being a member of that club of physicians, or at least experiencing themselves as entering that club slowly but surely, and not feeling like an outsider or someone who's an outcast or illegitimate in some way. Finally, there's a focus on competence or mastery. Students, medical students, physicians in training, health professional students in general are constantly seeking a sense of their competence, their mastery of the requirements of their professional role. So specifically in terms of relatedness, that sense directly into professional identity, and is very much one of, in a certain sense, keeping up with the Joneses, vying for a sense of being well within the group versus being excluded or exported from the group. We look for validation, whether from our peers or the authority figures that are training us as rising physicians. You'll hear students asking each other about grades when in fact how one student does or another student does really doesn't impact one's development, but it's a way of checking and tracking. Am I still with the pack or am I being left behind? The trap that this leads to in terms of imposter syndrome and self-doubt is that we can misperceive where we are. We too often compare our insides with other physicians in training, their outsides. The outward appearance of other peers and even of our supervisors and instructors always more shiny and polished than it actually is in reality. We don't see all that goes into attaining of success, or for that matter, the ways in which people are falling short at their own attainment of professional success. The biggest problem with that is when we feel that sense of success being present in others and have questions about whether it's present in ourselves, we can develop shame. And shame really is an emotion that exists to monitor and ensure safety at the social level, belonging and mattering in order to have the protection of the group. So when we feel that we're falling outside of the group or in any way not meeting the norms or requirements of the group, we are left feeling ashamed of ourselves. And it will lead us to isolate and withdraw. So it's a slippery slope. I want to just highlight a couple specific components of shame. So it comes from that need for social approval and acceptance, not because we're insecure, but because by definition, biologically and even from an evolutionary perspective, we've thrived as a species in large part because of our relying on strength in numbers. Students who attempt to attain success as a physician in training all on their own often run out of steam, run out of energy. They lack sufficient ability to resource for the difficult journey ahead. And whether they get their energy and resources from their peers or faculty or personal role models or family and friends, those social resourcing efforts fuel the ability to stay in the game and to maintain one's stamina to wake up each day and do hard things. Shame is endemic to the learning setting, but is made worse in the presence of racism because we're left having to interpolate whether our falling out of compliance with the norms is because of our professional performance and ability or our personhood. When we're judged by the hue of our skin color, when we're judged by our gender, or perhaps even because of a physical disability or lack of physical disability, that leads us to feel that we can't compete despite our otherwise capable resources. And it leaves us having a crisis of faith in the sense of whether we really want to compete at the game when it's played that way. So that is further intensified because there's a lot of ambiguity in training. There's so much uncertainty as to where I stand and whether I'm getting it, whether I've learned how to study, whether I can deploy the skills under pressure when I'm being graded in a with the video recording playing. Those opportunities to demonstrate competence are so high stakes that it is often difficult to register what's going on. And as a result, I'm that much more vulnerable to the biases that may come across from the environment. The notion of shame is really one of self-consciousness. When I'm already feeling like I'm behind the 8 ball because someone's judging me on my personhood rather than my capability, it infects my ability to focus. Again, I talked earlier in the mental skills part about emotional hijacking. When I'm having to mind whether the person's seeing me differently because of attributes that have nothing to do with my medical competence, I'm now fighting a battle on competing fronts, and it divides my attention, it distracts me, and it puts even greater pressure on me to perform at a unrealistically high level. So that experience becomes corrosive and even becomes an inside job where we can feel that we've almost done it to ourselves or succumbed to something despite our knowing we don't want to. And in order to combat that phenomena, we have to deconstruct what our professional identity consists of, what our personal identity consists of, in order to understand how to hold on, how to stay the course. I want to briefly read, and then I'm going to conclude and allow for any comments or questions. This is a scenario from the article that I cited here. Again, just came out this year, a really well-designed qualitative study looking at the presence of shame in medical students. This was done through qualitative interviews and asking students to speak about their experiences of shame across various aspects of their training and personhood. So I'll read this vignette just to give a little bit more concrete characterization of the phenomena that I'm speaking about. This is a narrative directly from the article, so I need to give credit to the authors accordingly. From day one of medical school, Monique has questioned whether she belongs. As an African American, Monique wonders if she was admitted to meet a quota or via a special system for minority students. Her state college background and below the school average MCAT score have entrenched this concern. As a first-generation college student, she also feels the weight of family expectations. Accordingly, Monique feels intense pressure to perform at a high level to prove that she belongs. She's painfully aware that the majority of students in her class came from prestigious schools and seem smarter than her. Competing against them seems futile. When Monique scores well below the class average on her first test, these doubts become deep-seated self-beliefs. She is convinced that she's not smart enough, that her admission was a mistake, that she does not belong at this prestigious school, and that she should disenroll. She feels shame. She isolates herself and withdraws from social interactions with classmates and optional school-related events. So this is a scenario that's all too familiar in terms of the students I work with. The particulars could be different, but the point is that this student's experience has zero to do with her actual ability to complete the requirements to become a first-rate physician. This is exactly the scenario in which the sense of personal identity being undervalued in the system, the lack of full inclusiveness contributes to uncertainty on the student's part, whether their very typical developmental stride as an early medical student is because of their ability or because of the difficulty of medical school itself. And before anyone can even insert themselves in that student's life to help them to deconstruct and differentiate the components that contribute to shame, they're already far down the path considering stepping down from their dream. And so that's the battle every day, is to help students to take back their dream, to help students to refuel each day, to persist at their dream, and most of all, to help students be mentally strong, mentally fortified, and mentally skilled to keep clear about difficulty being different than ability. So I just want to end with a shout out to this amazing group of students from Tulane's medical school. This past year, these students field trip to a nearby historical site that was a former plantation and has preserved quarters that previously had housed African Americans who were enslaved. The picture circulated not only all over the internet, but in many news media outlets. And I love the quote that the students attributed: "We are our ancestors' wildest dreams." They spoke about how their Blackness is a source of resilience rather than stigma, that their Blackness makes them better doctors rather than weaker, that their taking on the white coats is exactly the challenge that they were destined for. And to their credit, they've even got a website where you can purchase copies of these pictures, and they've got an initiative where they're going out to schools to communicate to children the ability to see where one comes from simultaneously with where one's going. That is the essence of powerful social identity. And I couldn't do better justice to it than that picture. So I want to thank everyone for tolerating my technological challenges and joining me this morning for this really wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Virtua. That was very informative. We have time for a few questions. The first one is, as a white medical professional, how do you address sociocultural differences with minority patients, and how do you check your white privilege when dealing with minority patients?
So that's obviously a critical question. And I would argue that in addition to my whiteness, my gender and my age are also fundamental aspects of what I bring to the table. And so each day, what I commit to my students is that I will never represent knowing something that I don't know, that I won't front that I understand things that I don't actually. And so I need to do a good amount of asking. And despite very extensive training as a clinical psychologist in multiculturalism, as it was referenced during my days, those notions of cultural background are global and population level. With each student, I have to rebuild my understanding of one's cultural identity, including race. And as I said before, as part of my commitment to cultural humility, it can't just be a buzzword. I have to go other places to learn, and to not just learn about other cultures, but probably most importantly, to examine my own position in our society. In that sense, privilege is, to me, about my access to power and resources. And I try to, I actually have no choice but to examine that daily, because the inspiration I get from my students forces me to recognize how fortunate I am.
Thank you. Kind of on that topic of staying informed, we have another question. How do you balance trying to stay informed with the world, or how do you suggest we balance trying to stay informed with the world while studying in medical school and keeping your mental health in check?
Yes, so one of my favorite things is to exchange quotes with students and motivational websites. And what I think of is that we have to be, and the royal we as in terms of medical students, have to be very greedy about refilling their fuel tank every day, but also very opportunistic. So a little can go a long way. And I think sometimes the access to the spoken word, to inspiring music and art is often a very quick source of fuel. Folks don't have time every week to attend a conference of this quality, but we can always turn on a song that reminds us of who we are and where we came from and where we're trying to go.
Thank you. Finally, we'll have one more question, and I'm just going to mention now, I put the links to the next sessions in the group chat so everyone can find those easily, but really quickly, we'll just have one last question. How do you deal with issues that lean into the political realm without revealing your bias, regardless of where your patient leans?
That's interesting. I don't know that hiding my bias is useful or even feasible goal. I think I have an obligation to acknowledge my values and acknowledge where those values may or may not congru with those of the person I'm working with. That puts them in the driver's seat. One thing I didn't mention about my approach is it's very much focused on strength and agency of the individual I'm working with. And so if I'm transparent, they can make decisions as to what's best for them.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time and for all the information you've shared with us today. It was really, really amazing.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.